It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Venezuela's opposition recently, that is on Monday, turned in 1.8 million signatures, almost 10 times the number required to the country's National Electoral Council in order to activate a constitutionally guaranteed recall referendum against President Nicolas Maduro. Following President Hugo Chávez's death, Maduro won the April 14, 2013 election with a very thin margin of 1.5% against Enrique Capriles. If unchallenged, President Maduro's term will carry on until the end of 2018. With us to discuss the opposition's latest strategies and the broader situation in Venezuela is Steve Ellner. Steve is Professor Emeritus of History from Universidad del Oriente in Venezuela, where he has lived for over 40 years. His most recent book is Rethinking Venezuelan Politics. He's joining us from San Francisco today. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's good to be on the program again.
Steve, so the signature collection process is just the first step in the recall process. The next step involves collecting signatures from 20% of registered voters. Almost 4 million signatures are required to activate a recall. So what is the likelihood that this will actually take place, Steve?
It's hard to make predictions because there certainly is a lot of discontent in Venezuela because of the current situation. Actually, two very pressing problems. One is the shortages of basic commodities and the distribution system, which means long lines and many, many hours to get basic commodities on the one hand. And on the other hand, a situation that should be solved within the next couple of weeks, but that is the electricity shortages, the power outages as a result of the drought, which is the biggest that Venezuela has had in many, many decades. So the situation is tense, and there is a lot of discontent. In fact, many of the Chavistas stayed home in the last elections in December as a kind of protest vote. But on the other hand, the other thing to consider is that in spite of the discontent, the opposition has not succeeded in creating a groundswell in favor of their positions. The opposition is also fairly unpopular in Venezuela. So there's somewhat of a political vacuum. And that means that the outcome of this signature collection process and the recall is hard to predict.
Now, the opposition does control the General Assembly, and they have made several attempts to try to unseat President Maduro, the two demanding that President resign and one demanding that he shorten his term, and various other very unsuccessful strategies to unseat him. But that's because President Maduro and the Chavistas are controlling the Supreme Court at this point. Is there any chance that that scenario would change?
Very little. I think from the opposition's viewpoint, their best bet is the recall process, and that's embodied in the Constitution. The attempt to shorten Maduro's presidential term meets the objection of it being a retroactive measure. Maduro was elected, as you mentioned, in 2013. So his period extends for these 5 years, and even if that amendment is passed, it wouldn't be retroactive. Look at in the United States, the amendment that limited presidential terms to 2 terms or 2 elected periods was passed in the 1950s, but was not applied to President Truman. So I think the basic principle would be applied in Venezuela. And so I think that the most promising path for the opposition, from the opposition's viewpoint, is the recall election.
Steve, the opposition in Venezuela seems to be emboldened by what is going on in the rest of Latin America. By this, I mean the proceedings against Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, Dilma Rousseff, and now Lula in Brazil. What is your assessment of the success these proceedings that are going on and the attack on the left that's going on in terms of the success the opposition will have in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think that what is being clearly demonstrated is that there is a campaign, there's a pattern, and that pattern leads into the thesis that is promoted by pro-establishment commentators and right-wing commentators that socialism is inherently it inherently lends itself to corruption. That there's a inherent relationship between socialism and leftist governments on the one hand and corruption on the other. And it completely leaves out of the picture the fact that these corruption scandals, such as in the case of Brazil and in the case of Venezuela as well, implicate not only people in the government, but also people in the opposition and people in the private sector. Specifically in the case of Brazil, all the different parties, leading members of all the different parties are involved in this corruption scandal, along with the Workers' Party of President Lula and Dilma Rousseff. In the case of Venezuela, there's something similar going on. A system of exchange controls in which you have this wide disparity over the last couple of years between the official price of the dollar and the black market price of the dollar. That situation lends itself to corruption. Commercial.
And Steve, I must ask you, why isn't that situation being dealt with? I know that various economists have made proposals in terms of the exchange rates that are multi-layered in Venezuela. Why is that situation still lingering?
Sharmini, my point that I make in conversations and in some of my writing is that there isn't a simple fix. The problem is complex. There's no panacea. For the system of exchange controls was established as a result of the general strike of 2002-2003, and there was the threat of capital flight. In fact, capital flight was occurring, and so the government established these exchange controls. In other words, you can't just purchase dollars in order. You have to justify your use of dollars, and the system worked fairly well. You had the official exchange rate at one level, and the open market rate more or less twice that of the official rate. And that system worked fairly well up until late 2012 when Chavez was really in bad shape physically. He passed away shortly after that. And at that point, and we don't know exactly what the explanation is, but the official rate was at that point 2-to-1. The price of the unofficial dollar shot up, and that it's been that way ever since. Now, there's no quick fix, because if the government were to eliminate that system, you wouldn't have any dollars left in the country. Everybody would take their dollars out of the country. And if the exchange rate is increased threefold or fourfold in order to try to approximate the situation that existed before, you'd have the threat of rampant inflation. So I'm not saying that there isn't any policies that can be followed at all. I'm not that much of a pessimist, but I think that the situation is not at all easy.
Now, in addition to the economic situation and the exchange control crises that Venezuela has been experiencing, as you said earlier in this interview, there's also these issues of the drought and other shortages that are going on in terms of basic goods. But let's take up those issues in our next segment, Steve. Thank you for joining us for now.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.